Hello, my name is Steve, and you're watching my anchor test video number 104. My goal in doing all this is simply to find the world's best performing anchors, and in pursuit of that, I try to find challenging seabeds in which to test. One of them is a place I call Cobblestone, and it consists of round stones from about golf ball size up to grapefruit size. And modern anchors really don't do terribly well there. At best, they can bury their flukes. None of them can fully bury the entire anchor, including the shank. And holding power is so-so. Now, people have asked me, hey, why don't you try an old-fashioned Fisherman anchor? They do have a reputation of being a good rock pick, so I've done that. A good friend of mine, he's perhaps crazier about anchors than I am, and he has collected a whole front yard full of anchors just for decoration, and one of them is this 60-pound Fisherman. He's let me use it for this test, and let's go out onto the water and see just how well it does in that cobblestone. Okay, we'll get things started off with a very generous amount of road. Notice that it is an all rope road. I think that is how these anchors were designed to be used. Another thing I've heard is that you should set these anchors with a short scope, and that allegedly has the effect of lifting the shank and therefore presenting the fluke at a different or perhaps more favorable angle for setting. And we'll get to that here. I'll shorten the scope right down to the minimum. But I'll just let you know, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's super long, super short, or in between. This anchor never penetrates the seabed. The fluke, at no point does it penetrate even to the point where the shank is laying on the surface. So maybe just a couple inches is all it gets. And the maximum holding power that this anchor was able to develop at this scope was 115 pounds of thrust. And I'll mention that I have a 21-pound spade anchor, and it was able to hold or produce 150 pounds of holding power. So there's just no question that this anchor is terribly, terribly inferior in this seabed. And I'm going to show you some other seabeds here at the end of the video. It's inferior there as well. I did give this anchor many opportunities to set. I've cut out most of it, but it's always just the same. The anchor just bumbles along here. At some point, I think at this point here, we are holding 115 pounds of thrust. But then when thrust is increased up to 140 pounds, the anchor begins its drag once again. So now we'll give it another try at very short scope. It's only 5 feet of water, 12 feet of road, or 2.5 to 1 scope. And the goal here is to lift that shank up and hopefully present that fluke at a more favorable setting angle. But it doesn't work. It's virtually the same story. Toward the end here, I do creep into more shallow water. I get into 3 feet of water, which brings the scope up to 4 to 1, and I don't know if that was the magic number or not. I did get once where I think it might have held 180 pounds of thrust, but it was only the one time, so that's could have been an anomaly. Maybe the fluke just happened to catch on one of the bigger rocks. This is about 115 pounds of hold, and then the thrust bumps up a little bit, and it takes off again. The bubbles are the exhaust from the engine. Since we're so close, when I bump up power, it clouds our vision with exhaust bubbles. Now we're in the shallower water, so scope might be 4 to 1 at this point. The camera has drifted rearward due to the shallow water and the pennant being the same length. What's happened is the camera's right at the surface, so the anchor's a bit out of view. Somewhere in this time frame, though, the anchor did briefly hold that 180 pounds of thrust, but then it drug and was not able to repeat that. These Fisherman anchors have certainly never had a reputation of being easy to handle. That certainly applies here. We are moved over to a more typical seabed than the Cobblestone. This is my normal sandy mud seabed. It's not a challenging place to anchor. It's very rare that an anchor will not set readily, but this is one of them. Once again, just like with the Cobblestone, I don't believe this fluke ever penetrated more than a couple inches into the seabed. I do have lots of scope out, 6 to 1 at this point, but bear with me here. We'll get to the shorter scope. I think it's this point here that it held the greatest. It was 180 pounds of thrust. Maybe that fluke sunk in halfway. I couldn't tell from the turbidity, but when thrust was increased up to 220 pounds, it released and continued dragging. So very, very poor performance. I will note that I have tested a 2.5 pound dinghy anchor. That was the Mantis dinghy anchor. And in this seabed, that dinghy anchor held far more than this 60-pound Fisherman. Now the road is shortened up to just 75 feet in 25 feet of water, so we're at 3 to 1 scope. And again, the idea with the shorter scope is to perhaps lift the shank a bit to present the fluke at a more favorable angle for setting, and we'll just let it run here and you can see if that works or not. And to my eye, the shank is lifted. Of course, that also results in the anchor listing a bit as it rolls over onto one of the stalks. But I don't see it really penetrating. It actually held less than at the longer scope. It's only held about 140 pounds at the most. And I believe it's at this time that the anchor held the greatest at this scope in this seabed, and it just wasn't much holding power at all. And on this retrieval and all other retrievals, I never saw anything on the fluke that could impede its performance. Now I'll show you some very old footage. This is more than 5 years ago. I tested this 40-pounder. It is a disassemblable Fisherman style anchor. The Luke company produces these, but this particular one I believe was a copy. So I call it a Luke copy, 40 pounds. And I'm using all chain. The chain never lifts up, so we can assume this is basically infinite scope. The shank never lifts, and the fluke never bites in. What you see is what you get. The anchor didn't produce any holding power. It just drug along continuously. Note that the angle that the fluke has with respect to the shank, it's about 45 degrees, which is quite a bit shallower than the 60-pound version that I've been testing in this video. Here's another anchor from 5 years ago. This is a 100-pounder. It also has about a 45-degree angle between the fluke and the shank. I am using 3.3 to 1 scope, all rope, and lo and behold, it sets. And this is the only time out of all three anchors, all three Fisherman anchors that I've tested, that I think it actually sets and produces meaningful holding power. And it's probably a combination of the shallower fluke angle. I am using rope rode and pulling up on the shank a bit. I think that helped. And plus, this is just a 100-pound anchor. It was simply massive enough to penetrate this seabed. I wish I could tell you the maximum holding power of this anchor, but at the time I only pulled about 300 pounds. So all we can really say is that it did achieve a decent set. Well, one thing is for certain, this anchor makes a fantastic garden ornament and a very poor anchor. The only thing I can think of is that this angle between the fluke and the shank is too great. What I noticed is that that fluke was almost vertical as it was being drug along and just wasn't in anywhere close to sliding under the seabed. I did shorten up the scope to the point where I could lift the shank some and get closer, but I think what really needs to happen is that angle needs to change. Right now it's at 58 degrees. I'm not an expert with these anchors, but I do look at pictures online and I see some of the flukes are closer to 45 degrees between the shank, and maybe that would have a better chance of just sliding under. This seems like an old anchor. It's very well made. It looks old school, and I don't know what an official Fisherman anchor is supposed to look like. I can just say this one does not work. Okay, that's all I got for this anchor. Thanks for watching. Thanks for supporting my efforts here. As always, anchor safely. So long.